I hadn't been to Ryan's house in months, but somehow, as I stood at the bottom of the driveway, it felt different this time. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the pavement, painting the street in warm golds and deep oranges. Cicadas hummed lazily in the distance, and the faint scent of freshly cut grass clung to the air. I took a deep breath and started up the path, my shoes crunching lightly against the small stones. I didn't even have a chance to knock before the door opened. And there she was. Ryan's mom. She leaned casually against the doorframe, her hair slightly damp as if she just stepped out of the shower. Sunlight filtered through the trees behind me and caught the strands, making them glimmer like honey. A loose, cream-colored blouse draped softly over her shoulders, the fabric catching the breeze and moving with her. For a second, my throat went dry. I'd always known she was attractive in a quiet, graceful way, but something about seeing her in that light, calm, effortless, untouched by hurry, made me notice her differently. Her presence wasn't loud. It drew you in gently, like the way a song sneaks under your skin before you realize you're humming along. She smiled warmly. "It's been a while," she said, her voice low and steady. "Yeah," I managed, forcing a casual smile. "Ryan invited me over to hang out. Is he home?" Her lips curved slightly, almost teasing, though her expression stayed polite. "Not yet. He ran out to grab a few things, but he should be back soon." I hesitated, shifting my weight awkwardly, but before I could reply, she opened the door wider and stepped aside. "You can wait inside. It's too warm out here." The cool air of the hallway washed over me as I stepped inside, carrying a faint trace of something soft, vanilla, maybe, or jasmine. It suited her somehow. "Thanks," I said, glancing around. The house felt quieter than I remembered, as though time itself had slowed to match the soft rhythm of her movements. "Leave your bag here," she said, reaching out to take it from me. I hesitated but handed it over, and in that simple exchange, our fingers brushed. Warm. Light. Almost nothing. But not nothing. She didn't seem to notice, or maybe she did, and she just didn't show it. Either way, my chest tightened slightly, and I quickly shoved my hands into my pockets as she set the bag down by the stairs. When she turned back, her eyes lingered on me for half a second too long before she smiled again, softer this time, almost knowing. "Come on," she said, gesturing toward the living room. "You might as well get comfortable while you wait." I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady, but inside I already knew this visit wasn't going to be like the others. I followed her into the living room, trying to act casual, though my pulse hadn't settled since stepping inside. The room looked different than I remembered, softer somehow. Sunlight spilled through half-closed blinds, striping the wooden floor with pale gold. A faint breeze from the ceiling fan stirred the curtains, carrying with it the gentle scent of her perfume, warm and faintly sweet. She motioned toward the sofa. "Sit. I'll grab us something cold to drink." "Thanks," I said, lowering myself onto the edge of the couch. From the kitchen, I could hear the quiet clink of glasses, the low hum of the refrigerator door opening. A moment later, she returned carrying 2 tall glasses of iced tea. Tiny beads of condensation slid down the sides, leaving faint trails on her fingertips. She handed me one and settled into the armchair across from me, crossing her legs effortlessly. The blouse she wore shifted slightly, revealing the elegant line of her collarbone as she leaned back. "So," she said, stirring her tea absently with a straw, "how have you been? I feel like I haven't seen you in forever." I shrugged lightly. "Busy, I guess. Classes, work, all that." She tilted her head, her eyes settling on me with a kind of quiet attentiveness that felt disarming. "You always used to come around," she said softly, almost as if she wasn't talking to me but to herself. Then, with a small smile, she added, "I thought maybe you'd forgotten us." I shook my head quickly. "No, never. Just, life got hectic." She hummed softly, as though she understood more than I'd said. Her gaze dipped briefly to her glass, then returned to me, warm, searching, unhurried. There was something different about this moment. She wasn't just Ryan's mom anymore. She was someone seeing me, really seeing me, in a way I hadn't expected. Still writing? She asked suddenly. I blinked. You remember that? Of course I do, she said, smiling faintly. You used to sit in the backyard with that old notebook. You said it helped you think. I felt a little caught off guard by how much she remembered. Yeah, I admitted, glancing down at my glass. I still write. Just, not as much as I should. You should, she said gently, her voice low but certain. You're better at it than you think. For a moment, the air between us stilled, as if the hum of the ceiling fan had faded away. Her words carried a weight they shouldn't have, and I couldn't tell if it was her tone, her gaze, or just me reading too much into everything. I took a sip of my tea, trying to ground myself. The glass was cold, the sweet taste lingering on my tongue, but it didn't do much to steady me. Then it happened. She leaned forward to set her glass on the coffee table, and as she reached for mine, her knee brushed against mine, light, casual, maybe even accidental, but I felt it everywhere. She didn't apologize. Neither did I. Instead, she smiled faintly, like she'd just seen the first move in a game I didn't know we were playing. We'd been talking for almost an hour, though it didn't feel like it. Time seemed to move differently in that room, slower somehow, softer around the edges. I was mid-sentence when my phone buzzed on the coffee table. Ryan's name lit up the screen. Hey, I said, picking up. You on your way? There was a pause, then his voice came through, faint and distracted. Yeah, about that. I'm running late. Something came up. Might be a couple hours. I glanced at her instinctively. She was leaning back in her chair, sipping her tea with a calmness that almost felt rehearsed. All right, I muttered, hanging up. Silence settled over the room. Not uncomfortable, but different. He wouldn't be home for hours. Just her and me. She set her glass down carefully, the soft clink against the table louder than it should have been. Then she turned her gaze on me, steady, unreadable, but heavy with something unspoken. You came for him, she said softly, almost like she was reminding herself of the fact. And then, with the faintest curve of her lips, she added, But you'll stay for me. It wasn't the words that made my pulse spike, it was the way she said them. Calm. Certain. Not asking. Not teasing. Just stating something she already seemed to know. I froze, unsure whether to laugh it off or pretend I hadn't heard her. But she didn't give me the chance. Before I could respond, she stood and walked past me, heading toward the kitchen. As she moved, her shoulder brushed lightly against mine. It was fleeting, barely there, yet deliberate enough to leave my skin tingling where we touched. I turned slightly in my seat, watching her silhouette disappear around the corner. My chest tightened, the quiet thrum of my heartbeat suddenly louder than the hum of the ceiling fan above. Was she serious? Or was I just imagining everything? When she returned, she carried a small plate of fruit, setting it on the table between us. Her expression was perfectly neutral, as though nothing had been said. But then, when she sat back down, she crossed one leg over the other and leaned slightly forward, resting her chin against her palm. Her eyes found mine and stayed there. No hurry. No excuses. Just a steady, measured silence that felt like gravity pulling me closer. I reached for a slice of apple just to do something with my hands. When my fingers brushed hers on the plate, I pulled back too quickly, knocking my glass slightly. She caught it before it tipped, her hand steady and sure. Relax, she murmured, her voice low and almost amused. I exhaled slowly, realizing only then how tightly I'd been holding my breath. The air felt heavier now, charged in a way I couldn't explain. Nothing had happened. But something had shifted. And we both knew it. After a few more minutes of quiet conversation, she glanced toward the kitchen and said softly, You shouldn't sit here hungry while you wait. Come on, I'll make us something. I can just grab something later, I said, but she shook her head. It's no trouble, she replied, standing up with an ease that left no room for argument. Besides, it'll give us something to do. I followed her into the kitchen, trying not to overthink how natural this felt, being there with her, just the two of us. The warm glow from the under-cabinet lights softened everything, wrapping the room in a cozy hush. She opened the fridge and pulled out a few ingredients: pasta, fresh tomatoes, basil, moving with a practiced grace, every gesture smooth and deliberate. "You like pasta, right?" she asked over her shoulder. "Yeah," I said, leaning against the counter. "Pretty much anything, really." She smiled faintly. "Good. Makes my job easier." For a while, the only sounds were the soft chop of the knife against the cutting board and the quiet bubbling of water on the stove. I watched her work, sleeves rolled slightly, fingers deft and confident as she sliced through tomatoes. There was something mesmerizing about the way she moved, calm, deliberate, completely in control. "Here," she said suddenly, handing me a bunch of basil. "Tear these for me." I took it from her, our fingers brushing lightly, just enough to make me overly aware of how close we were standing. I focused on the leaves, pretending not to notice, but my chest betrayed me, tightening with every silent second that passed. At one point, she leaned across me to reach for the olive oil, her arm brushing mine, warm and soft. Neither of us acknowledged it, but the air seemed to grow heavier each time something like that happened. "This feels strange," I admitted without thinking, my voice lower than I intended. She paused, glancing at me. "Strange?" I hesitated, fumbling for words. "I mean, cooking with you. Like this. It feels—" I stopped myself. Her lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, not quite a smirk. "Comfortable?" she offered gently. I nodded slowly. "Yeah, comfortable." She stirred the sauce in silence for a moment before saying quietly, "That's not such a bad thing, is it?" I swallowed hard. "No. It's not." When dinner was ready, we sat side by side at the small kitchen island instead of across from each other. The soft clink of forks, the faint hiss of oil still cooling in the pan, everything felt amplified, more intimate than I could justify. Halfway through the meal, a loose strand of hair fell across my forehead. Before I could brush it away, her fingers reached over gently, tucking it back behind my ear. I froze. She didn't pull her hand back right away. Neither did I. And in that quiet, lingering pause, I realized something had shifted again, something I couldn't name, but couldn't ignore either. Dinner was long finished, but neither of us moved to end the evening. She carried our empty plates to the sink, rinsing them with unhurried motions, while I leaned against the counter, pretending not to notice how comfortable it felt, this strange, unexpected domesticity between us. "Come outside," she said softly after a moment, drying her hands on a towel. "It's cooler now." I followed her out to the patio. The night air was soft and heavy, scented faintly with jasmine from the garden. A low string of warm lights wound along the railing, casting a muted golden glow across the wooden deck. Somewhere nearby, crickets chirped lazily, their steady rhythm blending into the silence. She handed me a glass of wine and settled into the cushioned chair beside me, folding one leg beneath her. I sat back, trying to relax, but every part of me was too aware of her nearness. For a while, we just sat there, saying nothing, letting the quiet stretch between us like a delicate thread neither of us wanted to break. "You know," she said eventually, swirling the wine in her glass, "nights like this make me realize how fast life moves." I turned to her, catching the faint glimmer of the patio lights in her eyes. "What do you mean?" She gave a small shrug, the kind that carried weight despite its casualness. "You spend years thinking you have time. Then one day you wake up, and you realize half the things you thought you'd do, you never did." Something in her voice pulled at me, a softness, a trace of regret she wasn't trying to hide. "You still have time," I said quietly. She smiled faintly at that, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Maybe," she murmured, her gaze fixed on the dark stretch of trees beyond the yard. "Or maybe I just like telling myself that." I studied her profile in the low light, the curve of her cheek, the graceful line of her neck, the faint furrow between her brows as she drifted into thoughts she didn't speak. "You don't seem like someone who gives up on things," I said softly. That made her glance at me, really look at me, and for a moment it felt like the night narrowed down to just the two of us, breathing in the same fragile stillness. "You notice too much," she whispered, her voice almost amused, but there was something else in it too, something raw. I didn't know what to say, so I just smiled faintly and sipped my wine, letting the silence carry everything words couldn't. And then, without warning, she reached out and rested her hand lightly on my knee. It wasn't bold. It wasn't careless. It was quiet, steady, grounding, the kind of touch that said more than any confession ever could. My breath caught, and for a split second, I thought about covering her hand with mine. But I didn't. Either of us moved. Either of us spoke. And in that fragile pause, it felt like the entire night was holding its breath with us. The night grew cooler as the hours slipped by, the warmth of the day dissolving into a soft, restless breeze. I leaned back in my chair, sipping the last of my wine, when I felt the chill settle across my arms. Without a word, she stood and disappeared into the house. I sat there in the silence, wondering if I should finally excuse myself, if maybe I'd overstayed my welcome. But before I could move, she returned, carrying a light, soft blanket draped over one arm. "You'll catch a cold," she said simply, her voice quiet but certain. I started to protest, but she shook her head and stepped closer, unfolding the blanket with a slow, graceful motion. She draped it over my shoulders, and her hands lingered there for just a second, warm against the thin fabric, grounding me in place. "Thanks," I murmured, my voice rougher than I intended. She didn't sit back in her chair this time. Instead, she lowered herself onto the edge of mine, pulling a corner of the blanket over her own shoulders. And suddenly, we were side by side beneath the same soft warmth, our arms brushing lightly, sharing a silence that felt heavier than words. I could hear everything, the faint rustle of leaves, the hum of distant crickets, the soft catch of her breath when the breeze passed. It felt like the entire night had narrowed itself down to this single moment, as though the world outside the patio no longer existed. Her perfume, something faint and floral, maybe jasmine, mingled with the scent of the blanket, subtle and familiar. I became acutely aware of every inch between us, and of how little space there really was. I shifted slightly, just enough that my shoulder brushed against hers beneath the fabric. I told myself it was accidental, but when she didn't move away, I knew she hadn't taken it that way. After a long pause, she spoke, her voice low, almost thoughtful. "You're quiet." I swallowed, forcing a soft laugh. "Just thinking." "About what?" I hesitated, staring into the darkness of the yard. "About how strange this feels." She tilted her head slightly, her gaze catching mine in the dim light. "Strange good?" I exhaled slowly, my chest tight. "Yeah," I admitted. "Good." Something flickered in her expression, not quite a smile, but something softer, warmer. She shifted slightly, her thigh brushing against mine beneath the blanket, deliberate this time. Neither of us moved away. Our hands rested side by side on the chair's armrest, close enough that our fingers almost touched. And then, slowly, almost cautiously, the back of her hand brushed against mine. I froze. So did she. Neither of us looked down, but neither of us pulled back either. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a kiss. But it was something, small, fragile, charged, and it felt louder than any words we could have spoken. The blanket was warm, but the heat between us was different. Heavier. Closer. I don't know how long we sat like that, side by side, breathing in sync beneath the quiet hum of the night. But I knew, deep down, we'd crossed an invisible line, not with our bodies, but with our hearts. At some point, the soft hum of conversation faded into silence. We sat there beneath the blanket, listening to the crickets and the distant rustle of leaves, both of us too deep in thought to speak. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, minutes, maybe hours, but eventually, the low rumble of an approaching engine broke the spell. Ryan was finally home. I felt it before I even heard it, the subtle shift in her posture, the small inhale she took, like reality had just slipped back into place. She pulled the blanket from her shoulders and stood, smoothing the fabric between her fingers as if giving her hands something to do. You should probably head out, she said softly, her voice carefully even, hiding something underneath it. I nodded, trying to act casual even though my chest felt heavier than it had all night. Yeah. Guess I should. Inside, I grabbed my bag from where I'd left it near the stairs. She followed, leaning lightly against the hallway wall as I slipped my shoes back on. The warm glow of the overhead light cast soft shadows across her face, making the delicate lines around her eyes look gentler somehow. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence was different now, not awkward, not heavy, but full of something unspoken, like the quiet between heartbeats. Finally, she spoke, her voice low. Be careful on your way home. I glanced up, meeting her gaze. I will. Her eyes didn't move, didn't blink, didn't let go of mine right away. There was something there, something she wasn't saying, something neither of us dared to. I turned slightly toward the door, but before I could reach for the handle, she stepped closer, brushing her fingers against my shoulder. At first, I thought she was steadying herself, but then her hand lingered, fingertips lightly grazing the fabric of my shirt. You've grown up, she said softly, almost like she was speaking to herself. The words hit harder than I expected. My throat tightened, but I managed a faint smile. So have you, I said, immediately regretting it when her lips curved into the faintest smirk. Nice save, she murmured, amused, but there was warmth behind it, a softness she couldn't hide even if she wanted to. Ryan's car door slammed outside, jolting us both back into the present. She dropped her hand, her expression settling back into its usual calm composure. I stepped out onto the porch, the cool night air brushing against my face. I turned back once, just as she leaned against the doorframe. Her smirk was back, quiet, subtle, knowing. Good night, she said. Good night, I replied, but it came out quieter than I intended. As I walked toward my car, I could still feel the ghost of her touch on my shoulder, still hear the weight in her voice, still see that look in her eyes. Nothing had happened. Not really. And yet, everything had changed.